I left town for 48 hours to walk my daughter down the aisle. I came back in the same suit because I was too tired to change, and 3 living pieces of my childhood were gone. I'm not exaggerating. I turned onto the street and my heart did that small, urgent flip you get when something that should be familiar is suddenly wrong. From half a block away, I could tell the skyline behind my house looked off too open, too bright, like somebody had shaved the top off a memory. When I pulled into the driveway, the first thing that hit me was a smell I didn't expect: fresh-cut wood raw sap, that sweet, almost vanilla scent you get when someone splits firewood in January. Only it wasn't January and this wasn't firewood. My backyard looked like a logging site. 3 massive white oaks I'd climbed as a kid, the ones my parents planted long before I was born, were down to stumps in a field of pale sawdust, and the silence where the canopy used to be felt louder than a siren. The only thing louder than the silence, truth be told, was the sound of my neighbor's new waterfall pouring into her infinity pool, all sleek tile and smug geometry spilling over like it owned the valley. Her name is Claire Hallbrook. She moved in 3 years ago, bought the old Whitman place, tore it down in 6 months, and built what she called a contemporary statement, floor-to-ceiling glass, steel beams, limestone, so imported it probably felt jet-lagged. From her second-story deck, she had a panoramic view of the valley that, in her mind, should be uninterrupted. We'd had the usual small neighborly tensions at first, a comment here, a joke there. "You ever think about trimming those trees, Daniel?" She'd say over the fence with that tight, practiced smile, and I'd joke back, "They've been casting that shadow since 1894. I think we're all used to it." She'd laugh like it was a polite thing to do, but it never hit the part of her face that meant real amusement. Things escalated slowly like rust. Jackhammers replaced birdsong for months while she built her backyard resort, imported palms and western North Carolina heaters so she could swim into October lighting that made the place look less like a home and more like a sleek idea of a life she wanted to prove she could afford. Late one afternoon while I was raking leaves, she got more direct. "I had an arborist look at your oaks," she said, as if that was normal conversation. "He says they're stressed, possibly diseased. Could be dangerous." I told her my trees had been inspected by the city twice in the last decade. They were fine. She tilted her head like I was being naive and said, "If one falls on my property, that's going to be a liability." It wasn't about liability, not really. It was about a view and the thin place where entitlement and money meet. A year into her renovation, she made an offer that sounded reasonable on the surface. "What if I cover the cost of professional management? Just lift the canopy, remove the lower limbs." Professional management, I learned, is a nice way to say butcher job. Those lower limbs were half the reason those trees were magnificent. I said no, politely, firmly, because they were protected under the historic overlay. They were part of an urban forest designation pushed decades ago by people who wanted to keep that ridge from being smoothed into anonymity. Her smile went thin. She called me sentimental. I called her impatient. We didn't speak for weeks after. So when I walked into my backyard that Sunday and saw stumps, I didn't have to guess. I dropped my garment bag on the porch and went straight to the fence. Claire was floating in her pool, oversized shades on a clear drink, sweating at the edge, calm like the rest of the world had kept to its script. "You cut down my trees," I said. She blinked slow. "Daniel, you're back." "How was the wedding?" she said, as if that explained everything. She told me she'd had a certified tree service assess them, that they were structurally compromised, that there was risk. "Emergency mitigation allows action when there's imminent danger," she said now, sitting up cool as glass. "They filed the paperwork Friday morning," she pointed out. "I was in Charleston on Friday morning." She didn't even look like she expected sympathy. Her eyes went to the valley behind my house, the view she'd bought with design catalogs and contractors now open and bright, and she didn't have to say the rest out loud. I called the city the next morning. They told me emergency removal permits had been filed and that review could take weeks. Weeks. In the meantime, my backyard looked like grief, and Marissa, my wife, tried to be steady, telling me they're just trees with that quiet tenderness partners use when they think you need perspective. I didn't accept it. They were habitat. My Aunt Eleanor had been a botanist and had fought to get our hillside designated decades earlier as a corridor because migratory birds nested in those mature oak canopies. I hadn't thought about her files in years, but that night I went down into the basement and started digging. At first it looked like clutter-brittle maps, faded soil logs, old correspondence. Then I found a thick folder labeled Ridgerest Urban Forest Corridor, Federal Cooperative Agreement 1978. Inside were environmental impact studies, species inventories, and a recorded conservation easement covering private parcels along the slope, including mine and Claire's. 3 red circles on a map were almost exactly where my oaks had stood. The language was dry, bureaucratic, the kind that usually makes you glaze over until you find the line that changes everything. Removal requires federal review and ecological impact assessment. Federal review. I sat on the basement floor and felt my hands shake. I teach high school history. I believe in neighborly solutions and compromise. But holding those records, my aunt's careful handwriting letters to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Office, something shifted inside me. This wasn't petty then. It was bigger. Someone with money had decided the rules were suggestions and gone ahead anyway. The next morning I scanned everything, made calls. The woman at the state conservation office went quiet when I gave her the agreement number. "That corridor is still active," she said. "Any canopy removal should trigger an automatic review." "It hadn't," I said. I filed a formal complaint with Regional Fish and Wildlife and sent documentation to the EPA. I attached old family photos, birthdays, graduations, a tire swing proof they'd been mature and healthy. 3 days later, 2 government vehicles pulled up in front of Claire's house. I was grading papers at the kitchen table when I saw them, dark green SUV white pickup with an agency SEAL people in field vests with clipboards. They photographed the stumps, measured diameters, took soil samples. One biologist, a woman with mud on her boots, who later told me the big one was about 125 years old, knelt by the largest stump and ran her hand along the rings. "Prime canopy," she said, and suddenly I had 2 words in my chest that felt like justice. Things escalated quietly but thoroughly. Claire hired attorneys, plural, and the men in tailored suits started appearing at her property line with tablets. Conversations poured over the fence like bad weather. "What exactly did you file, Daniel?" she demanded near the mailbox, her tone controlled but tight. "The truth," I said. She told me the designation was outdated. I told her it auto-renews unless formally dissolved and showed her page 14 of the cooperative agreement. For a second, something almost human flickered across her face, then it hardened. "This will blow over," she said. It didn't. The preliminary findings were blunt removal of 3 mature oaks within an active corridor without federal assessment constituted unauthorized habitat destruction. Once federal investigators open a file, they don't stop at the obvious. They look at patterns. Her 2-year backyard renovation came under scrutiny. Pool excavation had cut into native root systems beyond her lot line. Several imported plants were invasive under state guidelines, and the engineered hardscape exceeded permeable surface limits. It wasn't just one violation, it was a pattern of reshaping the land without regard. A month after the trees were cut, there was a knock at my door. Claire stood there without sunglasses, hair pulled back, no poolside poise, vulnerable. It turned out in a way that makes you notice the human beneath the architecture. "You escalated this beyond reason," she began. "If they issue a full restoration mandate, I could be forced to remove the pool." I looked at the water feature that spilled toward the valley and said, "You cut down 3 healthy trees because they blocked your sunset." Her voice cracked when she answered that she'd worked her whole life for that house that she grew up with nothing and wanted proof she belonged. Underneath the arrogance, there was motive, a rival belonging, and that landed harder than any of our legal pleadings. Then the order came heavy as a brick in the mailbox. Certified letters, surveyors' orange flags marking an ecological restoration zone that covered nearly her entire backyard, the pool, the patio, the very things she'd spent 2 years building. The final determination read like a verdict: unauthorized destruction of protected canopy habitat within an active federal corridor, secondary ecosystem damage due to non-compliant excavation, mandated full restoration to pre-development ecological baseline, and a fine that wasn't symbolic. The pool had to go, the patio had to go, most of the exotic landscaping had to be removed, and there were penalties if restoration deadlines weren't met. The demolition started just after sunrise a month later. The concrete saw screamed jackhammers, cracked stone, water drained muddy down the slope. I stood at my fence line and watched as the place that had been a sleek showroom for a life she wanted became raw earth, not showy, not pretty, just honest work to undo the wrong. Claire came outside, once arms folded tight. Our eyes met for a second, and there was no fire in hers anymore, just something tired and stunned. Over weeks, soil specialists and native plant ecologists came in, not to stage another resort, but to re-establish habitat. Saplings went in white oaks, red maples, dogwoods, protected in staked erosion control blankets, humming with the small patient noise of things being fixed. Here's what nobody prepares you for when you win. It's not fireworks, there's no triumphant music, there's a quietness that settles in relief, sure, but also a hollow where the old canopy used to be. I still miss those trees. Justice pulled a slow machine-like lever and it made things right in a legal sense, but it didn't hand me back the exact branches I carved my initials into, or the tire swing where I proposed, or the shade that cooled July nights when we ate dinner on the back steps. It did, however, bring back something else, the principle that a place has a story and belongs to more than one person. A buyer eventually moved into Claire's house, a younger couple who actually came over with a bottle of wine and a handshake the first week. They loved the restoration project. They wanted to be part of the return. Claire sold the place and moved to a high-rise downtown, glass and steel, no trees tall enough to block anything. Sometimes I see her name on the transfer papers and wonder if she was ever happy in the way she thought she deserved to be. Maybe she is. Maybe she isn't. People come and go, but the land keeps its own memory. So what's the lesson buried in all of this? The thing that stuck with me once the paperwork quieted down and the saplings took root. Property rights matter. Progress matters. New people bring new energy. But not everything is disposable because it's inconvenient. Sometimes restraint is the courage required by community. Sometimes doing nothing is the bravest way to protect what matters. My Aunt Eleanor fought in a different era with clipboards and patience and a belief that habitat deserved a voice. That voice carried forward long enough to matter when it counted. I'll be honest, if you asked me months ago whether I would have filed those complaints to keep the canopy, I would have said yes without thinking. But I also know there's a cost to conflict, the stress, the neighborly fractures, the nights you lie awake, thinking about what you could have done differently. I'm not proud of the stress it caused my family. I'm grateful the law existed to help. What I want to know from you is this. Put yourself in one of our shoes for a second. If you were in my position, would you have pushed back the way I did, or let it go to keep the peace? And if you were in hers, newly arrived and wanting to prove you'd made it, would you have seen the trees as history to honor or obstacles to remove? Tell me what you'd do. Tell me about a time you had a boundary dispute, how it ended, what you learned. Share it not for likes or views, but because these are the conversations that remind us that a neighborhood is more than property lines. It's shared responsibility.